In the heart of a seemingly perfect town, behind the grand facades of wealth and influence, something darker lurked. Something that would go unnoticed for years, hidden beneath the polished surface of family life. This is not just the story of a crime, but a story of deception, manipulation, and the horrifying toll of unchecked power. It begins with the Follings family, a couple whose outwardly charming life was built on a foundation of secrets. Howard and Margaret Follings appeared to be the epitome of success. They were a model couple in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, surrounded by luxury, their mansion a symbol of their achievement. Margaret, a former pediatric nurse, and Howard, a successful investment banker, seemed to embody the perfect American dream. Their home was open to charity events, and their adoptions of numerous children presented them as saviors, rescuers of vulnerable lives. Yet, behind the gleaming surface of this family's charitable image, a far more sinister reality was being concealed. The Follings home, nestled in the hills of Millbrook, was a place where innocence would be stolen, not saved. 12 children were adopted, but none with birth certificates. Each of these children was hidden away, controlled, isolated, and made to live within the confines of a world built by Margaret's twisted beliefs. This story is not just about what happened behind the walls of their mansion. It's about how easily the world can be fooled when people in power wield their influence to hide the truth. It's about the children whose voices were silenced before they had a chance to speak out, the lives erased in pursuit of control. What happens when the darkest crimes are wrapped in the guise of charity? Before we move forward, remember to subscribe and stay with us. Every week, we dive into the unsettling truths that hide in plain sight, unearthing the stories that deserve to be told. Now, let's unravel the chilling history of the Follings family and the twisted system that allowed it all to happen. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, is one of those towns that feels like it was frozen in time. A place where everything seems to move at a slower pace, where the rhythm of life is dictated by the changing seasons and the familiar sound of neighbors' voices drifting across front lawns. It is a town where people wave as they pass by, and strangers feel like family by the time they've shared a cup of coffee. But, as idyllic as it may seem, there's something unsettling about a place where everyone knows everyone's business. Because in such a place, secrets are hard to keep. Yet, that's exactly what the Follings family managed to do. In 1978, the Follings arrived in Millbrook with a promise of reinvention. Howard, a successful investment banker, and his wife, Margaret, a pediatric nurse, had come to escape the pressures of their previous lives, or so it seemed. They were drawn to a decaying Victorian mansion perched on the edge of town, a house that had been vacant for years, whispered about by the locals, and often referred to as the haunted house on the hill. The house had seen better days, its once glorious windows boarded up, its once grand front porch falling into disrepair. But Howard saw potential. He and Margaret bought the property, determined to restore it to its former glory. And restore it they did. Over the next several years, the Follings transformed the house into a masterpiece, or at least that's how it appeared. The peeling paint was replaced with pristine white siding, and the sagging roof was replaced with new shingles that caught the sun's light perfectly. The mansion was soon the jewel of Millbrook, and with it, the Follings family became the center of attention. Neighbors were charmed by Howard's easy smile and impeccable manners, while Margaret's grace and poise made her an instant figure of admiration. They were the kind of couple you would want to invite into your home, the kind of people you would trust with your deepest secrets. Howard and Margaret were at every town event, from the annual potlucks to charity fundraisers. They donated generously to causes, hosted elegant dinner parties, and rubbed elbows with the town's elite. In a community that thrived on tradition and community spirit, the Follings quickly became a symbol of everything Millbrook stood for. But there was more to the Follings family than met the eye. From the outside, their life seemed perfect, a couple who had everything, including the ability to offer a loving home to children in need. After years of struggling with infertility, Margaret and Howard decided to adopt. Their first child, James, was adopted in 1980. The community rallied around the couple, throwing a baby shower and holding a special church ceremony in his honor. James was a beautiful child, full of life, and Margaret doted on him endlessly. But there was something about Margaret's devotion to her son that began to feel excessive. She was protective to an extreme. At church, when the pastor asked to hold James during the blessing ceremony, Margaret hesitated. Her discomfort was palpable, but it was brushed off by the community as natural maternal instinct. No one thought twice about her overprotectiveness. After all, this was the Follings, the couple who had everything and were well liked by everyone. Soon after James came Elizabeth, followed by Thomas, Catherine, and William. By 1985, the Follings had 5 adopted children under the age of 6, each one seemingly more perfect than the last. They were the picture of a loving family, and Millbrook adored them for it. But it was the rapid pace at which they adopted that raised eyebrows. In a town like Millbrook, adoption wasn't something that happened quickly. It was a process, a long and thorough one, with numerous interviews, home visits, and investigations. Yet, the Follings seemed to bypass all of that. They adopted one child after another, and each adoption seemed to be greeted with the same enthusiasm and joy. But there were small things that began to feel strange. For one, the Folling children were rarely seen outside the confines of their large home. They didn't play with other children in the neighborhood, and they were never spotted at school or community events. The Follings were active in every facet of Millbrook's social life, but their children remained hidden from the public eye, always kept within the protective walls of their mansion. The community began to ask questions, but they were questions that went unspoken. Why were the children never seen outside? Why were they kept so isolated? Why did they never interact with other children in town? Margaret, who had always been so outgoing and involved, became more reclusive. She no longer attended church events or social gatherings unless Howard was by her side. Neighbors started to notice that, despite her once flawless exterior, Margaret's demeanor had changed. She seemed more anxious, more defensive, and even more protective of her children. At first, these questions were brushed aside. After all, the Follings had everything: a beautiful home, wealth, social status, and they had been so generous with their time and money that no one wanted to criticize them. But beneath the surface, something didn't sit right. Margaret's strange behavior wasn't the only thing raising suspicion. The more children they adopted, the less people seemed to know about the Follings. How had they managed to adopt so many children in such a short period? Why did none of the children attend school or have friends outside of the family? And most disturbing of all, why did no one ever question the Follings about their rapidly expanding family? As the Follings continued to add to their brood, the town began to whisper, but those whispers were never loud enough to challenge the couple's carefully crafted image. Millbrook had a long history of being a quiet, peaceful town. A town where people trusted their neighbors and believed in the goodness of those around them. But as the years went by, more and more people began to wonder, was something darker lurking beneath the Folling family's picture-perfect life? From the outside, the Folling family was a beacon of charity, compassion, and the ultimate success story. Howard and Margaret's home was the epitome of affluence, and their lives were carefully curated for public admiration. The couple had already proven their worth in Millbrook through their financial success and social engagement. But it was their growing family, one that expanded at a rapid pace, that quickly became the focal point of their public image. The Follings' adoption journey began with James in 1980. The child was a beautiful, bright-eyed baby boy who seemed to complete the couple's life in ways their wealth and social standing never could. The townspeople celebrated with the Follings, throwing them a baby shower and holding a church blessing ceremony. Margaret, who had longed for motherhood, was ecstatic. But it wasn't long before her overprotectiveness became evident. Margaret refused to let anyone else hold James, even at his blessing. When the pastor asked to hold him, Margaret's reaction was noticeably tense. Her eyes narrowed, and she hesitated, only reluctantly passing James into the pastor's arms after a whispered conversation with Howard. While this possessiveness was initially dismissed as the natural protectiveness of a mother, it was the first sign of something that would soon unfold as a far more sinister dynamic. Margaret's need to control James was just the beginning. By 1985, the Follings had adopted 4 more children: Elizabeth, Thomas, Catherine, and William. The rapid pace at which they were expanding their family started to raise questions. The adoption process was long, complicated, and often challenging for most families, but the Follings seemed to bypass the typical hurdles. How was it possible that a couple, no matter how wealthy or well-connected, could adopt so many children in such a short time? It seemed improbable, even suspicious. Yet no one dared question them directly. After all, the Follings had done what every small town admired. They had opened their home to children in need. The children arrived, one after another, and the town embraced each new addition to the Folling family. But as the family grew, so too did the strange patterns of behavior. The children were never seen at school. Margaret, despite her background as a pediatric nurse, insisted on homeschooling them. They were always present at social gatherings, but they remained eerily distant from the other children in town. Never once did they engage in the typical childhood activities: sports, playdates, or even casual conversations with their peers. They appeared like shadows, always standing together, but never engaging with the world around them. Margaret was always there, hovering over her children with the same level of vigilance she had displayed with James. Even when the children were outside in the yard, she would be nearby, watching from a distance or quietly instructing them on how to behave. Howard, who was often away on business, was seldom present to oversee his children's daily lives. When he was home, he seemed to be an almost passive figure, content to allow Margaret to take the lead in managing their family. Neighbors who had initially admired the Follings for their generosity and charm began to notice the oddities in their behavior. The children, despite being of various ages, all seemed to have the same distant, detached demeanor. They didn't laugh, they didn't speak much, and when they did, their words were often curt and devoid of the joy and spontaneity that children usually exhibited. At one point, a neighbor, Elaine Winters, invited James over to play with her son. He seemed so lonely, she recalled. But Margaret always had an excuse. James was sick or had too much homework. The excuses were always similar, and as time went on, Winters and others in the neighborhood began to grow suspicious. But it was not just the isolation that was troubling. The more children the Follings adopted, the more evident it became that there was something deeply unsettling about how they were being raised. Margaret's obsession with controlling the children's every move was not limited to their social lives. It extended to their education, their routines, and their very identities. The Folling children were not allowed to form independent relationships outside the family. They didn't speak to other children at school, and they had no friends. Even the brief interactions they had with neighbors were mechanical and devoid of real emotional connection. At local events, the Folling children would sit in rows, perfectly aligned, never fidgeting, never showing any of the usual signs of childhood restlessness. They did not interact with the other children at these gatherings, and they rarely spoke to anyone outside of the family. Their behavior seemed robotic, as if they had been conditioned not to act like children but to conform to a set of rules and expectations imposed on them by Margaret. It was in these moments that the first whispers of suspicion began to surface in Millbrook. Was the Folling family simply eccentric, or was something darker at play? The rapid pace of adoption, the children's isolation, and the odd behaviors were starting to make neighbors uneasy. Yet most people brushed off their concerns. After all, the Follings had always been gracious and charitable. They seemed to be a couple who had it all: wealth, power, and a family they were trying to build. So why would anyone question their motives? The community's discomfort continued to grow, but it was never enough to spark serious action. The Follings remained a respected family in Millbrook, even as cracks started to appear in their polished image. What the community could not have known was that these cracks were only the beginning of the terrifying story that was unfolding inside the Folling mansion. The pivotal moment in the investigation into the Folling family began with a seemingly innocent accident. It was a warm summer day in 1987 when 9-year-old Thomas Folling fell from a tree in the backyard of the Folling mansion. The family's sprawling property, filled with tall oaks and sprawling greenery, had always been a source of comfort for the children. On that fateful afternoon, however, the normalcy of the Follings' idyllic life would be shattered. Thomas, the third adopted child, had been playing in the backyard, climbing one of the towering trees that surrounded their home. As he reached for a branch higher up, He lost his footing and plummeted to the ground. The fall was hard, and Thomas screamed out in pain. He immediately grasped his arm, clearly in agony, but Margaret, ever the controlling figure in the family, took charge of the situation. Despite her medical background as a pediatric nurse, Margaret did not rush Thomas to the hospital. Instead, she chose to treat him herself. She attempted to set the bone in his arm, but her efforts were futile. The fracture was more severe than she initially thought, and her attempt to realign the bone caused further damage. The break was compound, and the bone pierced through the skin, exposing Thomas to significant risk of infection. Even as Thomas's pain worsened, Margaret remained steadfast in her belief that she could manage the situation. She refused to take him to a hospital, insisting that she knew best. Days passed, and Thomas's condition deteriorated. The swelling in his arm increased, and the pain seemed unbearable. Still, Margaret hesitated to seek professional help. It wasn't until Thomas developed a dangerously high fever that Howard, who had been away on business, returned home and saw the extent of his son's injury. Alarmed by the severity of the situation, Howard immediately overruled Margaret and insisted that they take Thomas to Millbrook General Hospital. The delay in seeking medical attention had already taken its toll on Thomas's health. When Thomas was finally admitted to the hospital, Dr. Sarah Chun, the attending physician, was horrified at the state of the child. By the time Thomas was brought in, he was in septic shock, Dr. Chun recalled. His arm was infected, and the infection had spread to the surrounding tissue. We had to perform emergency surgery to save the arm. Thomas's condition was critical, and it was clear that the delay in treatment had put his life at risk. What troubled Dr. Chun further was Thomas's reaction to the injury. Throughout the ordeal, Thomas didn't cry. Not once. This wasn't normal behavior for a child in so much pain. Dr. Chun observed him closely, noticing that he didn't react with the usual distress that one might expect from a child in such a situation. When asked how he had broken his arm, Thomas looked at his father, Howard, before answering, as if seeking permission to speak. Dr. Chen's concerns only deepened when she requested Thomas's medical records. Upon investigation, she was told that no records existed for any of the Follings children. According to Howard, the records had been lost in a fire at the adoption agency, but Dr. Chun found this explanation dubious. It didn't sit right with her. A missing set of medical records could happen in rare circumstances, but the lack of any records for all of the children raised alarm bells. Howard's reaction to her questions only added to Dr. Chen's suspicions. When pressed for further details, he became visibly agitated. He gave evasive answers and, in a highly unusual move, threatened to transfer Thomas to another hospital. Dr. Chun knew that, as a doctor in a small town, challenging a prominent family like the Follings could jeopardize her career. But her instincts told her that something was terribly wrong. After the surgery, Dr. Chun knew that she couldn't ignore her growing concerns. She filed a report with Child Protective Services, expressing her worries about possible medical neglect. Her suspicions about the Follings family were not limited to the injury itself. She had begun to suspect that Thomas's injury, along with the refusal to seek medical help, might be part of a larger pattern of neglect or even abuse. The report was assigned to David Morris, a social worker who had been with the agency for several years. Morris visited the Follings home and interviewed Margaret and Howard. His report, filed 3 weeks later, concluded that there was no evidence of abuse or neglect. He noted that the home appeared clean and safe, and that Margaret explained her actions as being due to her fear of hospitals, a fear stemming from her own childhood. Morris's report closed the case, and life in Millbrook seemed to return to normal. However, for those who were paying attention, the red flags were impossible to ignore. The Follings were a respected family, and it seemed unlikely that anyone would question their actions. But Dr. Chun, along with some of the concerned residents in Millbrook, could not shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The passive response from Child Protective Services, combined with the eerie detachment displayed by Thomas and the other children, made it clear that the Follings family's facade of normalcy was exactly that, a facade. Thomas's injury had raised the first real alarm in the community. It was the moment that marked the beginning of the unraveling of the Follings family's carefully constructed life. What started as a simple injury soon morphed into a much more complicated and disturbing situation. Though Child Protective Services had closed the case, the questions lingered, and the community began to whisper more openly about the strange behavior of the Follings children. The case would not remain dormant for long. What Thomas's injury revealed was only the beginning, the first crack in a story far darker than anyone could have imagined. The questions that had once been dismissed were now impossible to ignore. And as the truth began to unfold, it became clear that the Follings family's secret was far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. As the years passed, the Follings family continued to live in the public eye, their social status cemented by their generosity and wealth. However, the growing number of adopted children, their bizarre behavior, and the increasing isolation from the community began to raise uncomfortable questions. The charm that had once made Howard and Margaret well loved in Millbrook began to wear thin. In a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, the Follings family's behavior increasingly seemed out of place, and the whispers started to grow louder. Despite the Follings' outward perfection, the children were hardly ever seen playing outside, attending school, or engaging with other kids in the neighborhood. This wasn't due to any obvious medical condition, but rather a palpable sense of detachment, one that made even the most casual observer uneasy. Margaret insisted on homeschooling the children herself, despite her limited experience with education. Though her background as a pediatric nurse could be seen as an asset, there was something distinctly off about her need to control every aspect of their lives. She didn't just teach them. She kept them away from the rest of the world, keeping them hidden from the community and their peers. This sense of isolation only deepened with the Follings' growing family. By 1987, they had 7 children under the age of 10. While other families in Millbrook enjoyed the freedoms of childhood, soccer games, birthday parties, playdates, the Follings children were kept sequestered. Margaret's overprotectiveness escalated. At public events, the children sat in rigid formation, stiff and silent, in sharp contrast to the typical chaos and laughter of other children. They didn't interact with the other kids at church, nor did they participate in the town's sporting events or school activities. It wasn't just a preference for solitude. It was a systematic refusal to let the children live normal lives. The children's behavior seemed robotic, controlled, and eerily uniform. One of Margaret's many rules was that her children were not allowed to speak unless spoken to. The rules of their existence appeared to be enforced with an iron fist. Neighbors like Elaine Winters, who had lived across the street from the Follings for over 2 decades, began to notice these strange dynamics. They were so perfectly quiet, she recalled. I remember the first time I saw them at church. 8 children, all sitting in a perfect row, not a single one of them moving or speaking, as if they were part of a ritual. The children's lack of engagement with their peers, along with their uncanny silence, struck Winters as deeply unnatural. Despite these oddities, it took several years for any significant concerns to be raised. After all, the Follings were respected in Millbrook. They were known for their generosity, and Howard's involvement in numerous community projects gave him significant influence in the town. As a respected businessman, he had connections with local leaders, doctors, and social workers. This, combined with Margaret's charm and grace, made it difficult for anyone to suspect that something darker was at play. No one wanted to challenge the Follings' perfect image, especially when they appeared so well-intentioned. However, as time passed, the cracks in the Follings family's perfect facade became harder to ignore. Neighbors began to notice the increasing frequency of odd behaviors from the children, and rumors about their strange lives slowly spread through Millbrook. I remember trying to arrange a playdate for my son with James Follings, recalled Patricia Hayes, a former Millbrook resident. James seemed so lonely, and I thought maybe he would enjoy some company, but every time I asked, Margaret had an excuse. The excuses were always similar. James was sick, or he had too much homework. Slowly, Patricia's attempts to reach out were met with silence. But that silence spoke volumes. More people began to see the troubling pattern, and the questions started to mount. Why did the children never seem happy? Why were they always so distant, so rigid in their behavior? Why were they never seen enjoying the same childhood experiences as the other kids? Margaret's increasing secrecy did little to quell the suspicions. If anything, it only made the Follings family seem more like a mystery, one that no one dared to solve. The increasing isolation of the children only served to further alarm those who had observed their behavior. James, Elizabeth, and the others were rarely seen outside, even during the summer months when most children in Millbrook were enjoying the warm weather. They never played in the parks, and they were never seen at any of the annual town festivals, which were a hallmark of small-town life. Margaret kept her children under lock and key, only allowing them to interact with a very select group of adults, including herself and Howard. Then there were the peculiarities in the Follings home. The mansion, once a symbol of the Follings' success, had begun to feel like a fortress. Neighbors noticed that the windows on the third floor were almost always shut, and the blinds were kept drawn. The occasional noises from the third floor, muffled cries, whispers, and shuffling sounds, only added to the growing sense of unease. But when anyone asked Margaret about the third floor, she had a simple answer. It was just for storage. The house, she claimed, was old, and the creaks and groans of the building were to be expected. Yet even as these strange details began to stack up, no one in Millbrook dared to confront the Follings directly. Their wealth, power, and influence kept them insulated from any real scrutiny. Margaret's charm and the Follings' impeccable reputation seemed to shield them from any challenge, even from those who were starting to suspect that something was amiss. The townspeople's hesitation to speak up in the face of mounting evidence was, perhaps, the most disturbing part of the story. Even as they whispered behind closed doors, no one dared to push the issue further. The Follings were too well established, too well liked. They were the perfect family, and the people of Millbrook didn't want to believe otherwise. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. What the people of Millbrook failed to realize was that the Follings' carefully constructed life was a facade that was about to be shattered in the most shocking way imaginable. The community's growing concerns were merely the first signs of a much larger, far more disturbing truth that was lurking behind the polished walls of the Follings mansion. And when the truth was finally revealed, it would leave the town of Millbrook forever changed. The discovery that would unravel the entire Follings family's carefully constructed world came unexpectedly, not through an investigation or an anonymous tip, but through a seemingly innocent encounter by a new neighbor who had the courage to ask the right questions. In the spring of 1993, Michael and Susan Fletcher moved into a house just down the street from the Follings, bringing with them their teenage daughter, Emily. Michael, a journalist with the Millbrook Gazette, had a keen eye for detail, and Susan, a social worker with years of experience dealing with children, had a sharp intuition about what might be hiding behind the Follings facade. From the moment they arrived in Millbrook, the Fletchers were struck by the oddities surrounding the Follings family. The mansion on Elm Street, once the envy of the town, now seemed shrouded in secrecy. Despite being active in the town's social circles, the Follings children were rarely seen. In fact, the only time they ventured beyond the gates of their home was when Margaret or Howard escorted them. Susan, with her experience working with children, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She noticed the children's strange, blank expressions, their aversion to eye contact, and the way they flinched at sudden movements, signs she had seen before in children suffering from trauma. But it wasn't until Susan spent more time with Margaret that her concerns began to solidify. Margaret had always seemed like a warm and gracious woman, but the more they spoke, the more Susan felt there was something being concealed. Margaret's obsession with maintaining control over her children was evident in every conversation. When Susan tried to inquire about the third floor of the house, Margaret explained it away as just storage, but Susan's instinct told her otherwise. One afternoon, while visiting the Follings home, Susan saw something that sent a chill down her spine. As she passed by the house on a routine walk, she happened to glance up at the third-floor window and noticed a child, a girl with long, dark hair, peering out. The moment their eyes met, the girl quickly ducked out of sight. Susan had never seen this child before. She had met all of the Follings children by that point, and none of them had this girl's appearance. Her gut told her that something was very wrong. When Susan casually mentioned the child to Margaret the next time they spoke, Margaret laughed it off, claiming it must have been Elizabeth or Catherine, two of the older adopted children. But Susan knew for a fact that it wasn't either of them. She couldn't let it go. The more she thought about the child she had seen, the long hair, the pale skin, and the strange, terrified look in her eyes, the more certain she became that the Follings were hiding something far darker than anyone had realized. This unsettling encounter pushed Susan to do something she had never done before. She reached out to Michael, her husband, who had been quietly investigating adoption fraud and child trafficking in the area. He had been following leads related to some questionable adoption agencies in neighboring states, and when Susan shared her suspicions, Michael's instincts kicked in. The timing of the Follings' rapid adoptions and the strange behavior of their children matched up with patterns he had uncovered in his research about illegal adoptions and missing children. He began digging deeper, looking into the records of the Folling children, but he found that the adoption agencies they had used had been unusually secretive. Around the same time, Susan, unable to shake her growing concerns, decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't just ignore what she had seen. Armed with a gut feeling and the knowledge that something wasn't right, she decided to speak to the authorities. She filed a report with the local police, outlining her concerns about the Folling family's children. At this point, no one had made a direct connection between the Follings and any illegal activity, but the disturbing signs were beginning to add up. Detective Richard Cooper, a young but determined officer with the Millbrook Police Department, was assigned to look into Susan's report. Initially, the investigation was slow, as there was little concrete evidence to support the claims. The Follings were well-respected citizens with a spotless reputation. They had connections in every corner of Millbrook, and their charitable work had endeared them to nearly everyone in town. Howard Folling was a pillar of the community, a man with influence, wealth, and the kind of social capital that made people hesitate to question his actions. But Detective Cooper had his doubts. Something about the Folling children's behavior didn't sit right with him, and he began to dig deeper. What happened next changed everything. On the morning of October 23, 1995, armed with a search warrant, Detective Cooper and a team of officers entered the Folling residence. Howard was at home, as were the children, all of whom appeared to be awake and sitting quietly in their rooms. There was no sign of panic, no sign of alarm. It was as if the children had been waiting for this moment. Cooper and his team made their way through the house, questioning the children and observing their interactions. What they found in the third-floor rooms was nothing short of horrifying. 3 children, severely malnourished and covered in sores, were found locked away in rooms that were nothing more than bare spaces. There were no toys, no books, no signs that these children had ever been allowed to live as children. The rooms were dark, cold, and smelled of neglect. The children were terrified when they saw the officers, huddling together in fear, hiding their faces. These children had been kept in isolation, their existence hidden from the world. They had no birth certificates, no documentation, and no connection to the life they had been forced to endure. The Folling children had been victims of a twisted, deliberate plan to erase their identities and keep them hidden. What began as a mystery of isolation had now become something far more sinister. The discovery of these children was just the beginning of the shocking truth about the Folling family. A truth that would tear apart the lives of the children they had adopted and change Millbrook forever. With the discovery of the 3 hidden children in the Folling mansion, the investigation into the family quickly escalated into a full-scale inquiry. What had initially seemed like a case of child abuse turned into a horrifying case of child trafficking, adoption fraud, and systematic manipulation. The authorities, now armed with evidence, began to dig deeper, uncovering a web of deceit, psychological abuse, and crimes that spanned years. Detective Richard Cooper, who had initially been skeptical about the Follings, found himself at the center of a much larger investigation. The discovery of the locked rooms and the children hidden on the 3rd floor had been just the beginning. The officers who had participated in the raid were horrified by what they had uncovered, but they knew they were only scratching the surface. The Follings' apparent wealth, influence, and impeccable reputation in Millbrook made it clear that they had been operating in plain sight for years, hidden in the community's blind spots. The first breakthrough came when the police began reviewing the Follings family's adoption records. To their shock, many of the adoption documents were incomplete or entirely missing. The children they had adopted had no birth certificates, no official records, and no traceable histories. Howard Follings, when questioned, claimed that the paperwork had been lost in a fire at one of the adoption agencies. But the more the authorities looked into it, the more suspicious it became. The Follings had adopted multiple children across several different states, but their records were either sealed or mysteriously absent. It wasn't long before investigators discovered that the Follings had worked with adoption agencies that had been previously shut down due to unethical practices. These agencies had been known to place children without proper documentation, making it easier for the Follings to adopt children who were less likely to be missed. The children they chose were often from marginalized communities, children in foster care, children of migrant workers, and children whose parents had no resources to fight back. The Follings had taken advantage of these children's vulnerability, and it was clear that they had been using the adoption system as a means to create their own twisted family. With each new discovery, the scale of the Follings' operations became clearer. They had managed to slip under the radar of the authorities for years, using their wealth and status to manipulate the system to their advantage. But it wasn't just the fraudulent adoptions that were alarming. It was the way Margaret controlled the children. It became increasingly clear that Margaret had created a system of psychological control that was every bit as manipulative and abusive as the physical abuse the children had endured. The investigation revealed that Margaret had isolated the children from the outside world, keeping them hidden from the community. They were not allowed to form relationships with other children, not even with each other. They were raised under strict rules, never allowed to deviate from a rigid schedule set by Margaret. Any sign of disobedience was met with harsh punishment, and any attempt at independence was quickly stifled. The children were taught to believe that they owed their very lives to Margaret, that she was their savior, and that they could never question her authority. Psychological evaluations of the children revealed that they had been systematically brainwashed. Their responses to questions were robotic, as though they had been trained to say only what Margaret wanted them to say. "Sir and Madam provide everything we need. We are happy here," they repeated over and over, as if it had been drilled into them. These children, despite their age, had no sense of autonomy. They had been conditioned to believe that their worth was tied to their obedience, that their suffering was a necessary part of the process of cleansing that Margaret believed in. As the investigation continued, the authorities uncovered even more disturbing information. The Follings had established a series of trust funds for their adopted children. While these trust funds seemed like a generous gesture, the terms were deeply controlling. The children could only access their funds when they turned 25, but only if they met specific conditions. They had to maintain regular contact with the Follings and were forbidden from seeking any information about their biological families. This was yet another form of control, designed to keep the children dependent on their adoptive parents for their entire lives. But the most chilling discovery came when the authorities began to dig into Howard Follings' involvement. Howard had long maintained that he had been unaware of the full extent of Margaret's actions, claiming that he was simply supporting his wife's desire to have a large family. But the evidence painted a different picture. Howard had signed all of the fraudulent adoption papers and had been involved in the creation of the locked rooms on the third floor. While he may not have been the one to carry out the rituals or directly abuse the children, his role in enabling Margaret's actions was undeniable. Howard's passive complicity was a crucial part of the Follings' success in keeping their crimes hidden for so long. He had used his wealth and status to create a life of privilege for himself and his family, while at the same time allowing Margaret to control every aspect of the children's lives. His influence within Millbrook, along with the Follings' high social standing, had shielded them from scrutiny for years. It was only when the authorities began to piece together the evidence, combining the testimonies of former housekeepers, medical professionals, and the children themselves, that the full scope of the Follings' abuse came to light. As the investigation continued to unfold, it became clear that the Follings' actions went far beyond simple neglect. They had created a system of control that was both psychological and physical, one that had kept their children locked away from the outside world and made them complicit in their own abuse. And yet, even as the authorities closed in, Howard remained calm, a picture of detachment, while Margaret became increasingly hysterical, fighting to maintain her grip on the children she had spent years manipulating. The haunting story of Howard and Margaret Follings will forever be etched in the annals of Millbrook's history. What began as a story of a seemingly perfect family, a couple admired for their wealth, generosity, and seemingly altruistic mission to adopt children, quickly devolved into a nightmarish tale of manipulation, abuse, and control. But even as the truth behind the Follings family's actions emerged, the lingering effects of their crimes would prove to be far more profound and far-reaching than anyone could have anticipated. The investigation into the Follings' activities unveiled the full scale of their crimes. But the true horror was not only in their fraudulent adoptions or the physical abuse of the children. It was in the psychological manipulation that lasted years. The Follings had systematically broken down the children's sense of self, shaping them to fit Margaret's twisted vision of salvation. For these children, the scars left behind weren't just physical. They were deeply emotional, psychological wounds that would take years, if not a lifetime, to heal. The Follings case stands as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of children in a system that is often more concerned with appearances than the well-being of the children it seeks to protect. The rapid adoption of children by a wealthy, well-connected couple should have raised red flags, yet the system allowed these children to fall through the cracks. Adoption, a process that is meant to provide a loving and stable home for children in need, became a vehicle for abuse under the Follings' control. How could a system designed to protect children be so easily manipulated by two individuals who, on the surface, seemed like the epitome of the perfect family? But the Follings case is also a call to action. It is a reminder that we, as a society, cannot simply look the other way when we see signs of abuse or manipulation, no matter how wealthy or respected the perpetrators might be. The people of Millbrook were too blinded by the Follings' wealth, status, and social standing to question their behavior. Neighbors, doctors, and social workers noticed the signs: the isolation, the strange behavior of the children, and the rapid expansion of the family. Yet no one acted. The tragedy of the Follings case is that it took years for anyone to ask the right questions, and even then it took a brave few, like Susan Fletcher and Detective Richard Cooper, to dig deeper and expose the truth. The failure of the community and the systems in place to protect the children speaks to a larger issue of accountability. The Follings case was not just about two people's twisted beliefs. It was about a community's failure to see beyond the surface. It was about the ease with which abuse could be hidden behind the guise of wealth and respectability. The Follings had the means to shield themselves from scrutiny, and they did so with chilling precision. But the question remains: how many more families like the Follings are out there, their darkness hidden beneath the surface, their power and influence enough to protect them from the truth? The trauma inflicted on the children, particularly those who were hidden away, is a tragedy that will echo throughout their lives. For the children who were locked away in the third-floor rooms, their suffering was unimaginable. Severely malnourished, physically abused, and emotionally isolated, these children had their very identities erased. They were left to live in the shadows, unseen and unheard, until the day they were discovered. For them, the road to recovery will be long, and even now, many of them will carry the scars of their time with the Follings. As for the other children who survived the Follings household, their lives have been marked by the abuse they endured. James, the oldest of the adopted children, took his own life in 1998, just 3 years after the Follings were arrested. Elizabeth has struggled with severe anorexia for much of her adult life, and Thomas disappeared after turning 18, never to be seen again. The rest of the surviving children were placed in foster care or adopted by new families, but they too carry the psychological scars of their childhoods. They were taught that love was conditional, that obedience was more important than their own identities, and that suffering was a necessary part of life. Yet, even in the face of such immense suffering, the story of the Follings case is not one of total loss. There is, in some ways, hope in the way the surviving children have fought to rebuild their lives. They are not defined solely by the abuse they endured but also by their resilience in the face of it. Some of the children, after years of therapy and support, have found the strength to speak out and share their stories. They have become advocates for children's rights, using their voices to raise awareness about the dangers of unchecked power and the need for more robust protections for vulnerable children. However, the emotional toll of their experiences cannot be overstated. The psychological damage caused by the Follings will stay with these children for the rest of their lives. The process of healing will be slow, and the scars of their past will always be a part of them. But through their advocacy and their efforts to rebuild, they are showing the world that, even after the darkest of times, healing is possible. The lasting impact of the Follings case extends far beyond the individuals involved. It changed Millbrook, and it changed the adoption system forever. The Follings Act, passed in 1998, required more rigorous background checks for adoptive parents, stricter regulations on adoption timelines, and regular home visits for the first 5 years after an adoption. These reforms, though necessary, cannot undo the damage done. But they stand as a testament to the idea that, even in the face of horrific abuse, change is possible. The Follings case reminds us that no matter how perfect a family may appear on the surface, we must always be willing to look deeper. We must ask the difficult questions, challenge the assumptions, and, most importantly, protect the children who cannot protect themselves. The truth, however dark, must always come to light. As we reach the end of the story, we cannot forget the lesson it teaches us. A lesson that transcends the individual actions of the Follings family and calls each of us to do better. The tale of Howard and Margaret Follings is not just one of horror, but also a reminder of the need for vigilance, awareness, and accountability in our communities. It is a stark reminder that evil often lurks in the most unexpected places, behind closed doors, within the most respected families, and under the guise of charitable intentions. The Follings case may be shocking, but it is not an isolated incident. Every day, children across the world fall victim to systems that are meant to protect them but fail to do so. The vulnerability of children, particularly those in the foster system or those who come from marginalized backgrounds, is something that we cannot ignore. The Follings children were not just victims of abuse. They were victims of a system that failed to see their suffering because of the Follings' wealth, status, and ability to manipulate the system. This failure speaks to a broader issue, the need for constant, rigorous scrutiny in child welfare systems everywhere. But the Follings case also offers us an opportunity. It is a call to action for all of us to be more aware, to question the status quo, and to demand better protections for children. The changes brought about by the Follings case, such as the Follings Act, which introduced more stringent background checks for adoptive parents and regular home visits, are steps in the right direction. However, they are just the beginning. There is still much work to be done to ensure that no child is ever again subjected to the kind of abuse and manipulation suffered by the Follings children. We must commit to protecting our children. This doesn't just mean ensuring they are safe at home. It means protecting them in every environment, from their schools to their communities. It means demanding that those in positions of power, whether in government, education, or healthcare, take their responsibilities seriously. And it means being willing to speak out when we see something that isn't right, even when it's uncomfortable or difficult. The children who survived the Follings household did so because a few brave individuals, like Susan Fletcher and Detective Richard Cooper, refused to remain silent. They saw the signs and they acted. We must follow their example. If we see something, we must say something. It is not enough to be passive observers in the face of injustice. It is not enough to wait for someone else to step up. The Follings case showed us that silence can be just as dangerous as enabling. When the warning signs were first visible, when neighbors saw the children's strange behavior, or when questions arose about the rapid pace of adoption, no one questioned it. No one spoke up, and no one looked deeper. And by the time the truth came to light, the damage had been done. We must demand accountability from those who hold the power to prevent abuse. The Follings case highlighted serious gaps in the child welfare system, particularly in the areas of adoption and oversight. If it can happen in a small town like Millbrook, it can happen anywhere. We must advocate for stronger regulations, more thorough background checks, and greater oversight of adoption agencies. Children should not be pawns in a system that allows people to exploit their vulnerabilities. We must push for reforms that protect children in the foster system, ensuring that no child is left in an environment where they are neglected or mistreated. We need to ensure that adoption agencies are held to the highest standards and that they are never allowed to place children with families who are not equipped to care for them. Support organizations that protect children and support survivors. There are many organizations dedicated to preventing child abuse, supporting children in the foster system, and helping survivors of trauma heal. Whether through volunteering, donating, or simply spreading awareness, we can all contribute to the effort to protect children from abuse. But it's not just about the organizations, it's about all of us. We are all part of the solution. Every time we speak up, every time we raise awareness, every time we advocate for change, we help build a society that protects children and helps them thrive. It's also crucial to provide support for survivors of child abuse. The survivors of the Follings household, like many others who have experienced similar trauma, face challenges in rebuilding their lives. The emotional scars of their experiences will never disappear, but with the right support, healing is possible. It is our responsibility as a society to ensure that survivors have the resources they need to move forward, whether through therapy, support groups, or simply offering a listening ear. By supporting survivors, we give them the opportunity to reclaim their lives and find peace, despite the horrors they endured. The Follings case is a powerful reminder that no one is above scrutiny, not even the most respected members of a community. It teaches us that we must always look deeper, ask harder questions, and never be satisfied with appearances. But it also teaches us something else, that we have the power to create change. We have the ability to protect children, to hold systems accountable, and to support those who have been harmed. As we reflect on the Follings case, we must remember the lives that were forever altered. The children who were abused and exploited deserve to have their voices heard. Their stories need to be shared, and their suffering must never be forgotten. It is our duty to ensure that they are remembered, and that their stories serve as a reminder of the work still to be done.